Welcome to Raaonline. This is the continuation of ventricular system of brain, and this is the last part of that class. And today we are going to discuss about the third ventricle in detail and go and see some more questions related to the ventricular system of the brain. Now coming to the third ventricle, now this can come as a short note question in your exam. Normally it won't be asked as an essay question for undergraduates. It mostly comes as short note or very short answer or MCQ question. Now what is this third ventricle of the brain? Now to recap a little bit, as we know that the brain, the ventricular system of the brain mainly consists of the two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. So these are the main systems of the brain, the ventricles of the brain. Ventricles of the brain are cavities of the brain which contains CSF, and this CSF not only circulates within the ventricle, communicates with the subarachnoid space, and subarachnoid space is having CSF in which the brain is actually floating, and also it communicates with the central canal of the spinal cord, and even the subarachnoid space surrounding the spinal cord is having the CSF, and the CSF is produced within this fourth, the third and both the lateral ventricles, and being also recirculated, reabsorbed into the systemic circulation with the help of arachnoid villi or cranulations which are present within the lateral ventricles. Now coming to the class per se with the third ventricle, so we have to know that the third ventricle is the cavity of the diencephalon, or it is the slit or cleft between the two thalami. So what is it? It is a cavity of the diencephalon, okay, or it is a slit between the two thalami. Now what about the communications? So anterior superiorly, the third ventricle will be communicating with the lateral ventricles through the foramen of Monro. So the third ventricle is actually communicating with the lateral ventricles on either side. So you know that the lateral ventricles are 2 in number. They are present in each of the cerebral hemisphere, and there is a communication which is actually leading to the third ventricle in the center, which is single in number between the two thalami, and then the third ventricle will be communicating with the fourth ventricle with the help of the aqueduct of Sylvius, and the fourth ventricle will be continuous down through the spinal cord with as the central canal of the spinal cord. Not only this, they are not only intercommunicating, as I said that they are also opening up with the help of apertures into the subarachnoid space. Now, how does the third ventricle communicate? So these are the two lateral ventricles. And how does the third ventricle communicate with the lateral ventricle? That is with the help of the foramen Monro. How does the third ventricle communicate with the fourth ventricle? It is communicating with the help of cerebral aqueduct. This is the foramen of Monro. Okay, so anterior superiorly, the communications are with lateral ventricle through the foramen of Monro or the interventricular foramen. Posterior inferiorly in the median plane, the third ventricle will be communicating with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. So you can see this is the cerebral aqueduct. So the third ventricle is a cleft between the two thalami. And what are the contents of the third ventricle? The third ventricle will have the interthalamic adhesion fibers which will be actually connecting both the thalami, and between the two thalami there are interthalamic adhesion fibers which passes through the cavity of the third ventricle. Okay. Now coming to the diagram, if you have to see the third ventricle, you can see in this diagram that we are seeing the corpus callosum. So this is the corpus callosum. The various parts of the corpus callosum are the rostrum, the genu, the body of the corpus callosum, and the splenium. Just below the corpus callosum, you have the septum pellucidum and you have the lateral ventricles, and this is the fornix. So you can see the fornix over here. Okay. After that, as we come down, this becomes the lateral ventricle, which has been decoded or coded in blue. So you can see this blue line which is following the ependyma of the lateral ventricle. So how is the lateral ventricle connecting with that of the third ventricle? It is connecting through the interventricular foramen of Monro.